Thank you for inviting me to join this wonderful annual event hosted by the University of Washington Libraries. My name is Sara Curran, and I'm a professor of international studies, sociology, public policy, and governance at the University of Washington. I am also the director of the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology. I go by the pronouns she, her. And let me begin by sharing my screen with you. The census and the US Constitution have a special relationship, and it's particularly important on this occasion and this year in the midst of our decadal collection of an enumeration of the US population. And we need to remember and revisit why the purpose of the census and its inclusion in the US Constitution. My remarks are going to answer and discuss the answers to the questions: where is it in the document, how and why it was included, why it was so unique, and how it reflects the spirit of a more perfect union. To answer the first question, let's look at where it is located in the Constitution, and then consider the role of censuses in the long history of governance of human societies, and then revisit the particularly unique placement and, at the time, the novel relationship of the US Census to our constitutionally defined governance system. So it's located in Article 1, Section 2 of the US Constitution. The census is described in the 5th paragraph of the Constitution and the 3rd paragraph describing the people's house, the House of Representatives, and the method for determining apportionment of representatives. Apportionment and direct taxes is determined, and I quote, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States and within every subsequent term of 10 years. Now, the census was subsequently, this language was subsequently amended after the Civil War in Article 14, where they amended the Section 2, and they changed the wording around persons to exclude the ruling around 3/5 of all other persons following the Civil War. And we will revisit this briefly at the end of my reflection. Now, censuses have had a long history in human society and human governance. Some would say the earliest recorded censuses date back to Babylonian Empire or 2 CE. The word census, in fact, comes from Latin and in its origin. In the first census, some of the first censuses were taken by the Romans to count their dominions across the empire. But few, if any, of these earlier ones would really be associated with a true count of all persons, which is a somewhat unusual undertaking. What we now would say is the first modern census is that of the census in Iceland in 1703. In which they recorded exactly 50,366 people, and was about as accurate a census as any today. That's nearly a century before the first US census, which occurred in 1790. A wonderful book on that project, on the nature of censuses and their role in society, was written recently and published by Andrew Whitby, The Sum of the People. So censuses have been powerful tools wielded by those in power. And for the most part, typically censuses were used as a means to determine taxation, identify a populace for conscripting into military service, and deciding on the allocation of state resources or programs for governing. And they were a means of making claims about relative power. Larger countries, larger empires were afforded more power in terms of their populace. Those reasons still exist today and may still be the reasons for censuses in many other parts of the world. But let's think about how it relates to our founding framers' ideas. In fact, for them, the census was a key part of their notion of their Enlightenment ideas about representation and how to capture the notion of we the people. How does a republic accomplish representation? Well, one of the challenges, and this was debated in the 7 months that they spent debating and writing the Constitution, they debated how were they going to count and represent the apportionment for the various parts of the United States and the peoples in those places. The first question was, should it be based on land assessments or based on landholders? And the decision amongst the framers was that no, landholding was not going to give an adequate accounting of the people in the country at that time. There were going to be some people who were not landholders who were wealthy and who would not get counted under those determinations. And that might mean some underrepresentation of some persons. Should it be based on wealth, on an assessment of wealth and a distribution of that wealth, and therefore apportionment based on that distribution? In the founders' framers' mind, this was very difficult. It was going to be difficult to assess wealth. And they recognized that, in fact, conflicts of interest might arise vis-a-vis taxation. So if we had an accounting of wealth, it might then become easier to tax, which wasn't necessarily the purpose of the census in this paragraph, but it had been the purposes of censuses in previous governments that the founders and framers were aware of. So they were afraid that what would happen is you would have hiding of wealth and therefore an underrepresentation for apportionment purposes. So they settled on the idea of a count based on persons. Now, of course, this was seen as easier, but then it became a question of who to count, where, and what to observe about them. And what's important here is the where, because as you might think, it's easy to locate where wealth is or where land holdings are. It's harder to locate a person who might move around. Households might move, especially in the early times of the census. And if we're talking about representation and apportionment across the geographical scope of the country, they needed to place people into a territory and a location. And in order to do that, they needed to fix them in a place at a particular time. So the census statutory directions are about counting people in a place on a date. Nowadays, that date is April 1st, but it has been August in earlier centuries. And in fact, the first census day was August 2nd, 1790. Now, why was this such a unique moment in American history and in the Constitution? Well, first of all, it decoupled taxation from the purpose of the census. Secondly, it linked the census to governance, representation, and allocation of resources. It is the first constitution to guarantee a census in its founding document. Well, while that was noble and a great idea, one might say, the way we decided to count people has had to change, and in order to better reflect the the people of the country. And the founders were well aware of that. They recognized that they had to do a census on a regular basis because they knew that their country was going to grow and change, and they needed to reflect that, especially in order to have appropriate apportionment in the People's House, or the House of Representatives. One of the biggest changes happened in Article 14, right after the Civil War. And there's a wonderful book on this matter, on how we count and who we count and what we count about people, published by Melissa Noble's Shades of Citizenship, Race and the Census in Modern Politics, published in 2000. And I'll just mention that, as we know, there are many issues around who we count and how we count them. But the language in the census is about all persons. The framers recognized, as I said, that the country would change and that the census should reflect that change. The objective count has always been subjected to debate, but its value and public trust has grown with each decade. Privacy and confidentiality became codified to ensure trust in governmentality from the period of 1820 to 1910, and then reinforced in statutory terms after World War II and some of the breaches of confidence related to the Japanese internment. Those statutory requirements of privacy and confidentiality have not been broken since then. And this is a point of pride among those at the Census Bureau. Let me share with you a few pictures of census takers who travel the world, travel the country, accounting for people, talking to people. On the left, we have a young woman interviewing a census taker, interviewing another woman at her house early in the 20th century. Mid 1940s census, we have the census taker interviewing another woman from Alaska, and the person who is driving her stepping back, providing privacy for the census taker to ask the questions that he needed to ask. Nowadays, for the first time in 2020, the census has gone online, and there are fairly good sense that process worked fairly well. We have upwards in some states, including Washington State, almost 72% of the populace entered data via the online portal. In other states, it's much more difficult, and certainly in places where it's very remote, that was not the mode of accounting and doing the count. We still had enumerators going door to door to check on those that had not yet responded. But many would say, and I mentioned this here at the University of Washington, that the original big data and data science project of the United States was the census. And the University of Washington is proud to be the home of major data science projects itself. And nowadays we have enumerators who use handheld devices, but we still go door to door in some cases where we don't have a response. I hope this offered you a few thoughts about how we can think about the census in relation to the Constitution. And I want to thank the University of Washington Libraries for giving me this chance to share a few thoughts for you.